Hi, I'm Lucy. Thank you for joining me for another video, and if this is your first time here, a very warm welcome to you. I hope you enjoy it. If you want to believe in magic, in beauty, in friendship, and freedom, believe in the Black Stallion.
Biggest, and the blackest, and the strongest, and most beautiful horse that ever was.
Walter Farley's timeless classic, whose time has come. The story of a legendary horse who could only be tamed by a young boy's love. Together they survive a shipwreck. Alec opened his eyes. The sun, high in the heavens, beat down upon his bare head. His face felt hot, his tongue swollen. Slowly he pushed his tired body from the ground and then fell back upon the sand. He lay still a few moments. Then he gathered himself and once again attempted to rise. Wearily he got to his knees, then to his feet. His legs trembled beneath him. He unbuckled the battered life belt and let it fall to the ground. He looked around. He needed water desperately. He saw the black's hoof marks in the sand. Perhaps if he followed them, they would lead him to some fresh water. He was sure that the stallion was as thirsty as he. Alec stumbled along. The hoof marks turned abruptly away from the ocean towards the interior of the island. There was no sign of vegetation around him, only hot sand. He turned and looked back at the now calm and peaceful sea. So much had happened in such a short space of time. What had happened to the others? Was he the only one who had survived? His eyes closed and his lips moved. A few minutes later he turned and made his way up a large hill of sand. At the crest he stopped. From where he stood he could see the entire island. It was small, not more than 2 miles in circumference. It seemed barren, except for a few trees, bushes, and scattered patches of burned grass. High rock cliffs dropped down to the sea on the other side of the island. The black's hoof marks led down the hill, and a short distance away, beneath a few scattered trees, Alec saw a small spring water pool. His dry tongue ran across his cracked lips, and he stumbled forward. To the right of the spring, 100 yards away, he saw the black, hungrily feasting upon the dry grass. Alec again saw the small Arabian port, and the crowd gathered around the prone figure of the native who the black had struck. Would he be safe from the stallion? The black looked up from his grazing. The boy noticed that his halter and rope were gone. Somehow he had managed to get them off. The wind whipped through his mane. His smooth black body was brilliant in the sun. He saw Alec, and his shrill whistle echoed through the air. He reared, his front legs striking out. Then he came down, and his right foreleg pawed into the dirt. Alec looked around him. There was no place to seek cover. He was too weak to run, even if there was. His gaze returned to the stallion, fascinated by a creature so wild and so near. Here was the wildest of all wild animals. He had fought for everything he had ever needed, for food, for leadership, for life itself. It was his nature to kill or be killed. The horse reared again. Then he snorted and plunged straight for the boy. Alec didn't move. His body was numb. Hypnotized, he watched the stallion coming. Then 25 yards from him, the black stopped. The whites of his eyes gleamed. His nostrils curled. His ears were back, flat against his head. He whistled shrill, clear and long. Suddenly he moved between Alec and the spring. He pawed furiously at the earth. Alec stood still, not daring to move. After what seemed like hours, the stallion stopped, tearing up the earth. His gaze turned from the boy to the pool and then back again. He whistled, half-reared, and then broke into his long stride, running back in the direction from which he had come. Alec forced his legs into action, reached the spring, and threw himself on the ground beside it. He let his face fall into the cool, clear water. It seemed that he would never get enough. He doused his head, and he let the water run down his back. Then he tore off the part of his shirt and bathed his skinned body. Refreshed, he crawled beneath the shaded bushes growing beside the pool. He stretched out, closed his eyes, and fell asleep exhausted. Only once during the night did Alec stir. Sleepily he opened his eyes. He could see the moon through the bushes, high above in the star-studded sky. A big black figure moved by the spring, the black, and only a few feet away. He drank deeply and then raised his beautiful head. His ears pricked forward. He turned and trotted away. Alec awoke very hungry the next morning. He had gone a day and a half without eating. He rose and drank from the spring. The next thing was to find food. He walked for quite some distance before he found anything edible. It was a berry bush. The fruit was unlike that of anything he ever tasted before. But he might not easily find anything else that he could eat, so he made a meal of berries. Then he explored the island. He found it to be flat between the hill, which he had climbed the day before, and the rocky cliffs of the other side of the island. He made no attempt to climb over the large boulders. There were few berry bushes and little grass, and Alec realized that food would be scarce for him and the black. The island seemed to be totally uninhabited. He had seen no birds or animals of any kind. He walked slowly back in the direction of the spring. From the top of the hill, he looked out upon the open sea, hoping desperately that he would see a boat. Only the vast expanse of blue water spread before him. Below, he saw the black cantering along the beach. Alec forgot his problems in the beauty of the stallion as he swept along, graceful in his swift stride, his black mane and tail flying. When the horse vanished around the bend of the island, Alec walked down to the beach. The next thing that he must do was to erect some sort of shelter for himself. And first, he must find wood. Alec's eyes swept the shore. He saw one piece, then another. For the next few hours he struggled with the wood that he found cast upon the beach, dragging it back towards the spring. He piled it up and was surprised to see how much he had gathered. He looked for a long, heavy piece and found one that suited his purpose. He pulled it toward two adjoining trees and hoisted it between the two crotches. Suddenly his arms shook and he stopped. Painted on the gray board was the name Drake. It had been part of one of the lifeboats. Alec stood still a moment. Then grimly he fixed the plank securely in place. Next he leaned the remaining pieces of wood on each side of the plank, making a shelter in the form of a tent. He filled in the open ends as well as he could. With his knife he skinned the bark from a tree and tied the pieces of wood together. Alec went back to the beach and gathered all the seaweed that he could carry. He stuffed this into all the open holes. He surveyed his finished shelter. He was afraid a good wind would blow it down on top of him. He looked up at the hot sun and guessed it to be near noon. His brow and clothes were wet with perspiration from the terrific heat. He cut a long, slender staff from a tree, tested it, and found it to be strong. Carefully he skinned it and cut it in the right length. Then he tied his knife securely to the end of the stick with a piece of bark. A short time later, Alec stood beside a small cove which he had discovered that morning. The water was clear, and the sand glistened white beneath it. He seated himself upon the bank and peered eagerly into the water. He had read of people catching fish this way. After some time he saw a ripple. Carefully he raised his improvised spear. Then Alec flung it with all his might. The long stick whizzed down into the water and pierced its way into the white sand. He had missed. He pulled his spear out and moved to another spot. Again he waited patiently. It was a long time before he saw another fish. A long, slender shape moved in the shallow water beneath him. He raised his spear, took aim, and plunged again. He saw the knife hit. Fearing the knife would slip out of the fish if he pulled the spear up, he jumped into the shallow water and shoved it against the bottom. Desperately, Alec's arm flew down the stick, seeking the fish. The water was churned with sand. He came to the end. Only the steel blade met his searching fingers. He had lost it. For the rest of the afternoon, Alec strove to catch a fish. As darkness fell, he rose wearily to his feet and walked slowly back to his new home. His eyes ached from the hours of strain of constant searching into the depths of the water. On his way, he stopped at the berry bush and ate hungrily. When he reached the spring, he saw the black not far away. He looked up, saw the boy, and continued to eat. Moving from one place to another, he tore away at some small patches of grass that he could find. "I'll bet he's as hungry as I am," thought Alex. He dropped down and drank from the spring. Darkness came rapidly. Suddenly Alec felt the stillness of the island. No birds, no animals, no sounds. It was as if he and Black were the only living creatures in the world. Millions of stars shone overhead and seemed so close. The moon rose high and round, its reflection cast upon the pool. The Black looked up from his grazing. He, too, seemed to watch the moon. Alec whistled low, then louder and fading. A moment of silence. Then the stallion's shrill whistle pierced the night. Alec saw the Black look in his direction and then continue searching for grass. He smiled and crawled into his shelter. The day's work had made him tired, and he was soon asleep. The next morning found Alec beside the cove again with his spear, determined to catch a fish for breakfast. At noon he ate berries. Mid-afternoon he was sick. His head whirled, and he could hardly keep his eyes from closing. A small whirlpool appeared on the surface of the water. Alec grabbed the spear beside him and rose to his knees. He saw a gray shape in the water below. He raised the spear and moved it along with the fish. Then he plunged it. The spear quivered in its flight. He had hit it. He jumped into the water, shoving the spear and the fish against the bottom. He mustn't lose this one. His hand reached the knife. The fish was there, wriggling, fighting. Then he had it. Quickly he raised the fish from the water and threw it, and the spear, onto the bank. Wearily he climbed up and looked at his catch. 2 feet if it's an inch, he said hungrily. He drew out the spear, picked up the fish, and went back to camp. Alec washed the fish in the spring. And then he placed it upon a piece of wood and scaled it. Now, if he could only get a fire started. He remembered watching a native in India build a fire without matches. Perhaps he could do the same. He gathered some small pieces of bark, dry wood, and a deserted bird's nest, and spread them on the ground in front of him. He picked out the driest piece of wood, and with his knife, bored a hole halfway through it. Carefully he tore small threads of straw from the bird's nest and placed them inside the hole. They would ignite quickly. Next, he cut a sturdy elastic branch about 18 inches long from a nearby tree, skinned it, and placed one end in the hole. He leaned on the stick, bending it, and then rapidly turned the curved part like a carpenter's bit. It seemed to Alec that an hour passed before a small column of smoke crept out of the hole. His tired arms pushed harder. Slowly a small flame grew, and then the dry wood was on fire. He added more wood. Then he snatched the fish, wrapped it in some seaweed which he had previously washed, and placed it on top of the fire. Later, Alec removed the fish. He tried a piece and found it to be good. Famished, he tore into the rest of it. The days passed and the boy strove desperately to find food to keep him alive. He caught only one more fish. It would be impossible for him to depend upon the sea for his living. He turned again to the berries, but they were fast diminishing. He managed to keep his fire going as the heat made dried fuel plentiful. However, that was of little use to him, as he had nothing to cook. One day, as Alec walked along the beach, he saw a large red shell in the distance. He gripped his spear tighter. It looked like a turtle. Then hunger made him lose all caution, and he rushed forward, his spear raised. He threw himself upon the shelf, his knife digging into the opening where he believed the turtle's head to be. Desperately, he turned the huge shell over. It was empty, cleaned out. Only the hollow shell met Alec's famished gaze. He stood still, dazed. Then slowly he turned and walked back to camp. The black was drinking from the spring. His large body, too, was beginning to show signs of starvation. Alec no longer felt any fear of him. The stallion raised his proud head and looked at the boy. Then he turned and trotted off. His mane, long and flowing, whipped in the wind. His whistle filled the air. Alec watched him, envying his proud, wild spirit. The horse was used to the hardships of the desert. Probably he would outlive him. The boy's subconscious rose to the surface of his mind. "There is food, Alec. Food. If you could only find some way of killing him." Then he shook his head, hating himself. Kill the animal that had saved his life? Never. Even if he could, he would die of starvation first. The stallion reached the top of the hill and stood there, like a beautiful black statue, his gaze upon the open sea. One morning, Alec made his way weakly toward the rocky side of the island. He came to the huge rocks and climbed on top of one of them. It was more barren than any other part of the island. It was low tide, and Alec's eyes wandered over the stony shore. He noticed the moss-like substance on all the rocks at the water's edge, and on those that extended out, barred by the tide. What was that stuff the biology teacher had made them eat last term in one of their experiments? Hadn't he called it carrigan? Yes, that was it. A sort of seaweed, he had said, that grew abundantly along the rocky parts of the Atlantic coast of Europe and North America, that when washed and dried was edible. Could the moss on the rocks below be it? Alec scarcely dared to hope. Slowly he made the dangerous descent. He reached the water level and scrambled across the rocks. He took a handful of the soft greenish yellow moss which covered them and raised it to his lips. He It smelled the same. He tasted it. The moss was terribly salty from the sea, but it was the same as he had eaten that day in the classroom. Eagerly he filled his pockets with it, then removed his shirt and filled it full. He climbed up again, hurried back to camp. There he emptied the moss onto the ground beside the spring. The next quarter of an hour he spent washing it, and then placed it out in the sun to dry. Hungrily he tasted it. It was better, and it was food. When he had finished eating, the sun was falling into the ocean, and the skies were rapidly growing dark. In the distance, Alec saw the stallion coming towards the spring. Quickly he picked up some of the moss for himself and left the rest on the ground beside the pool. Would the black eat it? Alec hurried to his shelter and stood still, watching intently. The stallion rushed up, shook his long neck, and buried his mouth into the water. He drank long. When he had finished, he looked toward the boy. Then his pink nostrils quivered. The black put his nose to the ground and walked toward the moss which Alec had left. He sniffed at it. Then he picked up a little bit and started eating. He chewed long and carefully. He reached down for more. That night, Alec slept better than he had since he had been on the island. He had found food to sustain him and the black. The end of chapter 3. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, I would greatly appreciate it if you would please kindly give me a like, comment below, share with others, subscribe to my channel, and click the notification bell to be alerted of every time I upload a new video. Please come back to see the next one. Until then, bye for now and be blessed.